Hello, Embers. Welcome back to Ember Exchange. I'm Dylan.
And I'm Jill.
And today we're going to have a bit of a fun topic, I think. I think it's fun. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories. And that's a bit of a deviation, I think, from some of the stuff that we have been talking about, which has been super heavy theological, political, philosophical stuff. But I think there's still space here. Maybe I'll lead off with a bit of an understanding from a biblical standpoint how we should approach these. But mostly we just kind of want to have fun, talk about what conspiracy theories are, and then when Nick and Heidi join us, I've tasked everyone with bringing their favorite conspiracy theory, or not necessarily favorite, but one that they wanted to look more into, and so we're going to have some rousing discussion about that. So stick around if this is of interest to you. So let's stoke some conversation. All right. Well, before we dive completely into understanding what a conspiracy theory actually is the term conspiracy theory a conspiracy? That will be a part of it. I would like to just note that we are, as Christians, commanded to have nothing to do with godless myths. And so that is something to keep in mind as you investigate into these sorts of things. There comes a point at which God has given us reasonable minds to evaluate the world around us, and continuing to persist in false myths, perhaps, is one way of putting it, or godless myths, is not something that a Christian ought to do. So there's a limit to these things. They can be really fun to explore, but if you do find it taking over your mindset or the way that you live your life, maybe it's time for a little bit of extra reflection there. That's a reminder for me as much as it is for anybody else. Anyway, that's just going to be my upfront lead off to that. So, conspiracy theories. I think that my experience with this has always just been that it's a derogative term. And I don't know that that's necessarily the wrong thing. I think that in doing this, we encountered some various quote-unquote conspiracy theories that are really out there. To pick on a common one, flat earth theory, for example, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that that's not true, but there are some pretty diehard advocates of that still exist out there, and they'll go to great lengths to bend over backward to believe these things. But getting to conspiracy theory, we've kind of been splitting these out into define and then discuss and defend or whatever. So let's start off by defining. Jill, what would you define a conspiracy theory to be?
Well, the dictionary definition was just that it's a belief or explanation that attributes significant events or circumstances, and sometimes phenomena, to the actions of a secretive, sometimes malevolent group or organization rather than the commonly accepted explanation or randomness. And interestingly enough, as you were discussing that as Christians we should not dive into godless myths, it also kind of leans into the idea that conspiracy theorists, or like someone who comes up or believes in conspiracy theories, that definitionally has changed over time.
Yes, it has. So you say the dictionary, because conspiracy theorist, that phrase, right? It's two words. But when put together, that has its own definition that you found.
Correct.
But we could look just at like what is a conspiracy? Well, that's a group of people that are planning or plotting together to cause something to happen. A conspiracy. Usually that's a negative thing, right? You don't necessarily conspire. Well, I don't know. You could have a conspiracy to do a good thing. There's a secretive element, perhaps. And a lot of times things that are done secretively can be bad things, but I suppose you could come up with examples of good conspiracies, but it's people secretly coming together to plan and execute an event. And then a theory is, I guess we talked about this a little bit under the evolution discussion. I would be hesitant to give evolution the label of theory. But theory is like a term in the scientific process. You have a hypothesis. If you get data that supports your hypothesis, it can turn into a theory. In this context, I think it just means an unproven set of ideas. That admittedly in a lot of cases have some evidence pointing towards them
Sure, definitionally, though, it that is the case. However, I'd say now, currently, and maybe in the last, I mean, probably since we were kids, so a couple of decades worth at this point.
That it became a negative term?
Well, not even just a negative term, it's just an insulting name to
Right.
call someone.
Well, so it's
Like-
interesting that you should say that. It actually, so the term, and maybe you came across this too, it really became sort of this, I think it's called a pejorative,
Yeah.
right? A slur, or like a way to
Yes.
discredit somebody's argument by calling them unintelligent, right around and after the Kennedy assassination. So that is not one of the conspiracy theories that we're going to be discussing in this series of episodes. If you would like to do that, we're not doing that for a number of reasons. One, it would take a lot of time to go through all of the stuff associated with it. And two, there's a lot of people that have already done that in great detail. If you're interested, I'd say you take a look, because there's some very interesting things there to learn. But regardless of whether you believe that Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA or not, the CIA was not interested in having people attribute the assassination to them. You might say, wow, that's suspicious. Okay, sure, whatever. But they actually popularized and wanted to encourage the use of conspiracy theory as a discrediting term against anybody who wanted to say, there's something
Yes.
about this that doesn't quite add up.
Essentially, I saw that it just gets applied broadly to any individual that might even be raising legitimate concerns.
Yes.
Or alternative perspectives to something. And they're like, that's unreasonable.
Somehow,
It's just like unfounded.
yeah, somehow
Period.
it became this thing that if you get labeled this, then you're a kook. You're off your
Right.
rocker. Which
then-
isn't to say that not all conspiracy theorists are,
Right.
because there are some very
Correct.
kooky folks out
Yes.
there that believe some really weird things.
Right. But like you were saying, okay, that might start leaning towards or closer to the side of godless myths, while
Correct.
there is area to question certain things and there are legitimate reasons to do so. But we've essentially just polarized the word or the name conspiracy theorist to immediately shut down any sort of discussion or dialogue for, in some cases, nuance of a situation.
Correct, yes. If you don't agree with the official narrative, then your argument is discredited, not because of the arguments that you're making, but because you are a conspiracy theorist, and therefore your arguments can't be taken seriously, whatever they are.
Right.
Yeah, and we've seen this. I think probably the reason that it's most prevalent for us is because this was a word that got thrown around a lot in the context of misinformation. So misinformation and disinformation became a really big thing during COVID.
Right.
And it was like every other, not even day, but like every day, every other hour, if you paid attention to, which we don't really pay attention to, but the mainstream media would just be saying, oh, this is misinformation, that's misinformation, we need to censor this and shut down that person and ban them from speaking because they're spreading misinformation.
Right.
That kind of was the trendy term, or the modern way of describing this person as a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Or
There were conspiracy theories behind COVID, and again, another one we aren't going to get into, and not one that I picked out myself either, but there are and were tons of them all over the place. And some of them, yes, had legitimate questions and concerns, or in some cases evidence, but just immediately got shut down, or you were given the title conspiracy theorist. Okay, now all credit, or all...
Yeah, you've lost all credibility.
Yeah, you've lost all credibility.
And it got so bad there, this desire for, and right, a term that you're going to come across a lot when talking about conspiracy theories is they, that they want you to do, or they don't want you to know. And I hesitate to do that, because that kind of just punts the whoever this is to some unknown entity. Well, I don't know who that is, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
In some cases, that is actually important.
Right.
But for the most part, you can kind of just assume that it's a group of high power, global elite people. So anyway, I'm going to use they, cracked down so very hard through the media on what were legitimate things because it was counter to the narrative. They wanted to control that narrative so hard that the joke became, sorry, the joke became that a conspiracy theory or today's misinformation is the news 6 months from now. Because that was what was
Right.
happening, is people
Yeah.
would say, hey, this is happening. And they'd say, no, it's not happening. And then 6 months later, oh, guess it was happening. And I think what happened as a result of that is that you ended up with a lot of people going back, myself included, saying, well, I've been told all my life that this thing was a conspiracy theory. I've actively been watching them lie to me in real time.
Right. What is the actual evidence behind that so-called conspiracy theorist who's been discredited over and over now? Is there something behind what they were saying,
Exactly.
potentially?
And so that led me to go and reevaluate a number of things.
Right.
Any of the serious ones we're also not going to get into because, again, there's not time to do a good
And there's
job.
actually so many
There's
of
so
them.
many of them. So again, I'd encourage you to go and look into some of these things yourself. Or if you have a request for a specific one, leave us a comment. But that then also fueled the people that want to go to the very fringe things as well.
Right.
Because, oh, see, they lied to you about this one thing that you had evidence. They're probably also lying to you about these 100 other things
Yeah.
that you have absolutely no proof for.
Right.
So if you want to wade in here, you have to be discerning.
Correct.
And you can't obsess about it because I do know people who overdo it in this space. So.
And there's a little bit of, I guess, not value is not the right word I'm looking for, but the idea behind this, like they, again, going back to the actual definition where really conspiracy theory was more of just a neutral, it meant you were looking into something. It didn't have to mean you were one way or the other. But a lot of those do generally rely on claims of like hidden agendas and whether they are good or bad, but they do oftentimes involve, like you said, larger groups, powerful entities, governments, corporations, etc. And so it does oftentimes include a they. It's not, it isn't generally one person. It is a group of people.
Correct.
Or an entity that includes a group of people that might be either believing said thing or coming up with the theory. And also on the other side, the theory is about a group of people, not oftentimes individuals.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point too about the they and the group of individuals. It's not usually one person. One of the hardest parts, I think, if you were, let's say that you wanted to conspire, right? You wanted to do something that about which there could be a conspiracy theory that was true.
Sure.
The number of people involved, the more people you have, the more rapidly it becomes difficult to actually conceal this thing, right? So that's one way. It's not an exhaustive rule of thumb, but one way to look at a rule of thumb is how many people have to be in the know on this thing for real in order for this to be successful. And if it's, I said like a handful. Now that could be a handful of people, or it could be a handful of organizations. So, right, you think like the CIA, probably not. There's thousands of people in the CIA. I guarantee you that if there were a conspiracy to kill JFK, for example, not everybody in the CIA would be in on it and be able to know it, because as soon as you have thousands of people that know it, you're never going to be able to keep that secret
anymore.
right?
No.
So, then that's one argument that I hear used for and against conspiracies. You kind of got to evaluate how many people would have to be in on this for this to be successful.
Right.
And if that number is just unfathomably large, that's maybe a good idea that perhaps it's not a good conspiracy theory.
Right. I think that nowadays too, that changes a little bit. There could have potentially been larger groups 30 years ago, 50 years ago, when we didn't have instantaneous communication between literally, the globe, when today everything is so quick and the news is obviously attainable in an instant, that your group has to maintain itself size-wise to actually keep a secret, right? The more people that know it, the less secretive it's going to become, and a lot faster.
Yep. Yeah, so if there's a group of people in power and they're of a reasonable number that could conceivably keep a secret, that'd be something that might be a good candidate for a conspiracy theory if you're looking to make one.
Yes.
Another candidate is a place where the official story doesn't really explain or can't explain well all of the details.
Right.
And I want to be careful here because there is a category of conspiracy theory and theorist who, despite being presented with extremely obvious evidence that refutes their claim, essentially say, no, you made that up, which can happen. Or right, they're going to spin it, and no matter what you tell them, no matter what evidence you present that is in support of the truth, they're going to discredit that because they want to believe this other thing. However, there are certain narratives that don't explain all of the details. And so that's another place where saying, this main story that we're being told just doesn't really line up with the facts that we're seeing, and we have all these pieces of evidence, and you don't really have a good explanation for these. What's going on? That's another good candidate for a good conspiracy theory as opposed to a lame one.
However, at this point, I think, too, that the conspiracy theorist wording and use has been used so much, it reinforces like so much groupthink and like just throwing away your own individual thought on something that people don't take the time to think that through, especially when they see those words together, because that's what we've been kind of taught and trained now to not completely, but kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater when conspiracy theorist comes up.
Yep. Related to, I think, something that you said there, one thing that actually both sides, if you want to call them sides, the official narrative people and the conspiracy theorist people, a trap that both sides will fall into is the appeal to authority. So on one hand, you have someone saying, this government entity said it's true, so therefore it must be true. Okay, so like that's an appeal to, or this doctor said that it's this way, therefore it's this way. That isn't it's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. This appeal to authority that because experts said it, therefore it must be true.
Right.
The thing is that the conspiracy theorist would say, well, you can't do that. Why do you trust what fill in the blank expert says?
Right.
But then you talk to your like run-of-the-mill everyday conspiracy theorist, and they're going to say, well, I heard there's this Navy SEAL on this podcast who told me, and he works with this thing, or there's this guy, this lineman who puts up 5G, and he was on a podcast and he said this.
Right.
And so now again, and that's
there's an expert.
There's an expert that's being appealed to again.
Right.
And that's not to say that people sharing what they know immediately discredits that as useful information, because sometimes that's all you have to go on. But you can't just say because this person said it and they have some self-claimed or otherwise credential, that therefore means that they're always telling the truth.
Right.
In either case.
I guess in the last few episodes, we've maybe bashed on the Nuance bros a little bit in that sense, but in the area of conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists, in some sense, you do need a little bit of nuance instead of a loss of nuance. You kind of need some of that to explore all of the complex, evidence for and against in some of these theories.
Yeah, and I would almost even say, in order to preserve our ability to bash Nuance bros, I would say instead of calling it nuance, I would call it just discernment.
Sure.
Right? You need to be able to read things and not immediately just believe them because you agree or like the person that said it.
Right. And I think once you get categorized into one of these areas, I guess, expert or conspiracy theorist, then the next ditch you can fall into is just the fact that a lot of those, I listened to this podcast or this expert said X, Y, or Z, and so therefore I believe what's being said, then everything just kind of becomes an echo chamber on both sides.
Correct. Yes. I completely understand how it can be very fun and easy to find the echo chamber that you like and hang out there. And in some cases, actually, I think that's a very okay thing. Like if it's an echo chamber of Christian values and you guys are echoing about truth to each other, great. When it gets into these like borderline godless myth categories, that's when you start to have to be careful.
Right.
And God gave you a rational mind. Use your rational mind to evaluate things and don't jump to conclusions.
Right.
Okay. I think that pretty clearly defines what a conspiracy theory is, or a conspiracy theorist. Maybe as a parting note before we cut this one off, why should the Embers care? If an Ember doesn't care about a conspiracy theory or what conspiracy theories are, or this is not something that they've ever thought about, why is it important that they think about these things?
I think that you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'd argue that in a sense it's kind of like a muscle that you just need to work out. And
not the developing your own conspiracy
sorry,
theory.
no. Not developing your own conspiracy theories, but you've mentioned more than one time being discerning and just being, instead of being unaware of what's going on around you, being aware of what is happening in the world. It is a world that we do have to live in, though we are not of it. The idea that you want to learn to become discerning, conspiracy theories aren't the only place that you can use and practice your discernment. They are one of the places, though, that you can, and some of them are going to affect your life very directly, right? So, though maybe the conspiracy theories do not, but some of the evidence or information from different experts or different people is useful in your life for COVID, because COVID affected everybody. And so learning to discern those things is important, especially in that time and probably again in the future, because there will be other things that come up that the government, they come up with, or things that affect our lives in a very everyday, day-to-day sense. And so being able to discern and figure out the truth for you and your family, and from a Christian foundation, is important.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to conclude this also, was if you're at least aware of these things and the sort of tactics that can sometimes be used to label somebody as a conspiracy theorist, or that's misinformation, if you're not aware of that, it puts you in a very easy position to be manipulated. And so that in and of itself can be succumbing to the godless myths if you are not discerning and aware of the manipulation tactics that can be used against you. So that's just a picture of what this category of things is. Next up, we'll bring Heidi and Nick in, and we're going to talk about 4 different ones. I haven't really talked with everyone beforehand about the ones that they're going to present, so we might have people advocating for some very out there theories. And if that's the case, then the rest of us might, just try to bash them down. So it'll be a good, fun time, and I hope you'll tune in for the next one.
And thanks for being here. Burn bright.